Rain had been falling over the small town since early morning, the kind that never stormed loudly but lingered with quiet persistence. It coated the dirt roads in thin layers of mud and tapped steadily against the windows of the modest house where Elena Ward lived with her husband. From the outside, the house looked ordinary. A pale wooden porch, two narrow windows facing the road, and a garden that Elena tried to keep alive despite the stubborn soil. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and damp wood. Elena stood near the kitchen window, watching the rain slide slowly down the glass. She had always liked quiet days like this. Silence made the world feel safe. But that afternoon, something interrupted the calm. A dull knock echoed from the front door. Elena blinked, pulled her sweater tighter around herself, and walked down the short hallway. When she opened the door, a postal worker stood outside holding a large envelope sealed in thick cream paper. "Delivery for Elena Ward," he said, handing it over. She nodded politely. "Thank you." The envelope felt heavier than she expected. On the front, stamped neatly in dark ink, were the words of a legal firm she didn't recognize. She frowned slightly. Legal letters rarely meant good news. Back in the kitchen, Elena placed the envelope on the wooden table and stared at it for several seconds. Rain tapped against the window beside her, filling the room with a quiet rhythm. Her fingers hesitated before finally tearing open the seal. Inside were several official documents and a single typed letter. She began reading. At first, the words made little sense. Then suddenly, they did. Her grandmother, Margaret Holloway, had passed away 2 weeks earlier. Elena hadn't spoken to her in nearly 15 years. The old woman had lived alone in a large countryside estate several hours away, a place Elena remembered only in distant childhood fragments: tall trees, creaking stairs, and a garden that seemed endless. According to the letter, Margaret had left the estate behind. But not to just one person. The inheritance had been divided equally between two surviving relatives: Elena and someone else. Her cousin, Daniel Ward. Elena leaned back slowly in her chair, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. She whispered under her breath, "That can't be real." The estate described in the document sounded enormous: land, property, and a house that had apparently increased greatly in value over the years. For someone living paycheck to paycheck like Elena and Marcus, it felt impossible. Almost unreal. A car door slammed outside. Moments later, the front door opened and Marcus stepped in, shaking rain from his jacket. He looked exhausted, his hair damp from the weather, and his expression weighed down by another long day of work. "Rain won't stop," he muttered as he hung his coat. Elena was still staring at the letter. Marcus noticed. "What's wrong?" She slid the paper across the table. "I think something strange just happened." Marcus stepped closer and picked up the letter. At first, he skimmed the words casually. Then he stopped. His eyes slowed. He read the document again, this time carefully. Very carefully. Minutes passed. Elena studied his face, waiting for excitement, disbelief, maybe even relief. Their finances had been falling apart for months, bills stacked quietly in drawers. Marcus had changed jobs twice in a year, each one ending worse than the last. An inheritance like this could change everything. But Marcus didn't smile. Instead, his expression hardened in a way Elena didn't understand. "Shared?" he said quietly. Elena nodded. "With Daniel." Marcus looked up. "Daniel Ward?" "Yes," she replied. "We haven't spoken since we were kids." Marcus folded the paper slowly. "How much land is this place?" "I'm not sure," Elena said, "but the letter says it's valuable." Marcus stared at the document again, his mind clearly racing. For a moment, the room fell silent, except for the rain. Then he asked another question. "When do we have to go there?" Elena blinked. Go where? The estate, Marcus said quickly. We should see it. Meet the lawyer. Understand what we're dealing with. His tone was sharper than she expected. It's just a lot to process, she said carefully. Marcus leaned against the counter, reading the letter again. This time, his eyes lingered on the words describing ownership rights and land value. A faint tension crept into his voice. 50%, he murmured. Elena frowned. What? Nothing, he said quickly. But something about the way he said it made her uneasy. Dinner that evening was quiet. Marcus barely spoke, lost in thought, as he pushed food around his plate. Once or twice, Elena caught him staring at the documents again. Not with excitement, with calculation. Later that night, as the rain continued outside, Elena lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Marcus sat at the edge of the mattress beside her, the inheritance papers resting in his hands. In the dim light of the bedside lamp, his face looked different. Sharper. Focused. Almost hungry. Elena, he said quietly. Yes? When did you say Daniel was coming? She turned her head toward him. I didn't, she said softly. They mentioned contacting him. I assumed the lawyer already did. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he folded the letter again and placed it carefully on the bedside table. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling growing quietly inside her chest. The letter had brought opportunity. A new beginning. But as she watched Marcus stare into the darkness of the room, she realized something unsettling. He wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about the other half of the inheritance. And somewhere, miles away, Daniel Ward had no idea that a single letter had just changed all of their lives. The morning after the letter arrived, the rain had stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through the thin kitchen curtains, casting quiet streaks of light across the wooden table where the inheritance documents still rested. Elena woke early, expecting the strange tension from the night before to have faded with sleep. It hadn't. Marcus was already awake. He sat at the table with his laptop open, several sheets of paper scattered around him. Numbers were scribbled across a notebook in hurried handwriting. Elena paused in the hallway, watching him silently for a moment. You're up early, she said. Marcus didn't immediately respond. His eyes remained fixed on the laptop screen as he clicked through pages of information. Did you know that land out there has been rising in value for years? He finally said. Elena stepped into the kitchen slowly. What land? Marcus turned the laptop toward her. A map filled the screen. The estate, he said. Your grandmother's property sits near a development zone. If even half of these listings are accurate. He tapped a calculator beside the keyboard. We're talking about millions. Elena blinked. Million? Marcus nodded, his voice suddenly energized. Land, the house, maybe mineral rights depending on the property lines. He gestured toward the papers. This could fix everything. Everything. The word lingered in the room longer than it should have. Elena poured herself coffee, trying to process the shift in his tone. Only yesterday, the inheritance had seemed like a distant possibility, something complicated and uncertain. But Marcus was already treating it like a solved equation. You've been researching all night? She asked. Marcus leaned back slightly. Couldn't sleep. He ran a hand through his hair and glanced again at the screen. You know what this means, right? Elena sipped her coffee. It means we inherited something, she said carefully. Marcus shook his head. No, it means we have a chance. His voice lowered slightly. A real chance. Elena watched him closely. For months, Marcus had carried the weight of quiet frustration, jobs that didn't last, business ideas that collapsed before they started, the pressure of unpaid bills that neither of them talked about openly. But now something else had taken its place. Intensity. Marcus began explaining the numbers again. Property value estimates, potential buyers, land developers. The calculations spilled out quickly, as if he had rehearsed them in his head all night. But Elena noticed something else. Every time Marcus described the estate, he used the same word. Ours. Not shared. Not inherited. Ours. What about Daniel? She asked softly. Marcus stopped typing. For the first time that morning, his expression changed. Daniel? He repeated. Yes. The letter said the estate belongs to both of us. Marcus leaned back slowly. I know what the letter said. There was a pause. Elena folded her arms gently across her chest. We'll have to meet him, she said. Figure out what the lawyer expects. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. That's exactly what worries me. Elena frowned. What do you mean? Marcus closed the laptop halfway and looked directly at her. People don't just show up to inherit money without wanting more. He's family, Elena said. Marcus gave a quiet, humorless laugh. That doesn't make him trustworthy. The words felt sharper than she expected. Elena set her coffee down. You've never even met him. Marcus shrugged. I've met enough people like him. Something cold slipped into his voice. Relatives who disappear for years and suddenly reappear the moment money is involved. Elena hesitated. The truth was, she hadn't spoken to Daniel in a long time. Childhood holidays had faded into distant memories, and after her grandmother moved away, the family ties quietly dissolved. But Daniel had never been cruel. Just distant. He might not even care about the money, Elena said. Marcus looked at her with disbelief. Elena, it's a massive estate. His voice lowered again. Everyone cares about money. The conversation faded after that, but Marcus didn't slow down. Over the next few days, the inheritance became the center of his world. Every evening, Elena returned home to find more papers on the table. Market reports, land development plans, old satellite maps of the property. Marcus studied them with growing obsession. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and find him sitting in the kitchen again, the glow of the laptop reflecting off his face. One evening, she stepped quietly into the room. You're still working on that? Marcus didn't look up. I found something interesting. What? He pointed to the screen. The land surrounding the estate has already been purchased by developers. Elena leaned closer. And? Marcus's eyes gleamed faintly. If the estate gets sold, this entire area could become commercial property. His voice dropped to a whisper. Which means the land value will explode. Elena felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. Marcus wasn't just researching anymore. He was planning. But Daniel still owns half, she said. Marcus finally looked up at her. For a brief moment, something dark flickered behind his calm expression. Not if things change, he said. Elena stared at him. What does that mean? Marcus blinked, as if suddenly realizing how his words sounded. Nothing, he said quickly. I mean negotiations, buyouts, legal stuff. But the explanation came too quickly. Later that night, Elena lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. Marcus sat beside her, scrolling through his phone. By the way, he said casually, I got an email from the lawyer today. Elena turned her head. What did they say? Marcus locked his phone and placed it on the table. Daniel replied. The room went quiet. He's coming, Marcus continued. To see the estate. Elena felt a slow knot tighten in her stomach. When? Marcus looked toward the dark window. This weekend. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Marcus added one final sentence. quietly, carefully. We should be ready. Elena didn't know why those words made her uneasy. But as she watched Marcus stare into the darkness again, she felt something inside her shift. The inheritance had already changed their lives. And Daniel Ward hadn't even arrived yet. By the time the weekend arrived, the sky had turned a pale gray again, the kind of quiet overcast that made the countryside feel endless and slightly forgotten. Elena sat in the passenger seat as Marcus drove along the narrow highway leading toward the estate. Neither of them had spoken much during the drive. Fields stretched on both sides of the road, broken only by occasional clusters of trees and distant farmhouses. The farther they traveled, the more Elena felt like she was moving backward in time. She hadn't been to her grandmother's estate since she was 12. Back then, the place had seemed enormous, mysterious, almost magical. Now, as the road curved toward a long gravel driveway hidden behind tall oaks, Elena felt something else. Nervousness. Marcus slowed the car. "There it is," he said. The estate appeared slowly between the trees. The house stood tall and silent, its faded white paint worn by years of weather. The porch wrapped around the front like tired arms, and ivy crept up one side of the structure as if nature had been quietly reclaiming it. Elena stepped out of the car and looked up at it. For a moment, childhood memories rushed back. Summer afternoons, the smell of old wood, her grandmother's quiet voice calling from the kitchen. But the house felt different now. Still. Empty. Marcus walked ahead, studying the building with a calculating expression. "This place is huge," he murmured. The front door opened with a long, creaking sound when Elena pushed it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating furniture that had not been moved in years. The house felt frozen, as if time had simply stopped. Elena walked slowly through the entryway, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floors. Photographs lined the walls. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, faces she recognized and others she didn't. Marcus barely glanced at them. He moved through the rooms quickly, examining doorways, ceilings, and windows. 3 floors, he said quietly, and look at the land surrounding it. Elena wasn't listening. Her attention was caught by a photograph near the staircase. It showed her grandmother standing proudly in the garden, her arm around 2 children. One of them was Elena. The other, Daniel. A car engine sounded outside. Marcus froze. "That must be him," he said. Elena stepped onto the porch just as another car rolled to a stop near the gravel drive. The man who stepped out looked older than the boy she remembered, but the resemblance was still there. Daniel Ward closed the car door and glanced toward the house. For a moment, the 3 of them simply looked at each other. Then Daniel gave a small nod. "Elena." His voice was calm. She walked toward him slowly. "It's been a long time," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. 15 years, I think." Marcus stepped forward. "And you're Daniel," he said. The tone wasn't welcoming. Daniel noticed. "Marcus, right?" They shook hands briefly. Marcus's grip was firm. A little too firm. "Long drive?" Daniel asked casually. "Worth it," Marcus replied. Daniel looked toward the house. "I didn't expect it to be this big," he said. "It's impressive." Marcus folded his arms. "Yes," he said, "it is." The 3 of them walked back inside together. Elena led them through the house, opening doors that hadn't been touched in years. The kitchen still held old dishes and cabinets. The living room furniture remained covered in thin sheets. Daniel moved slowly through the rooms, occasionally pausing to study something. "This place hasn't changed much," he said quietly. Elena nodded. My grandmother liked things the way they were. Marcus remained mostly silent. But Elena noticed something unsettling. Marcus wasn't exploring the house like someone seeing it for the first time. He was observing Daniel. Every movement, every glance, as if measuring him. Eventually, Elena wandered into a study near the back of the house. Tall shelves filled with books lined the walls. A large wooden desk stood near the window. She opened one of the drawers. Inside were stacks of papers tied neatly with faded ribbon. Curious, she untied one bundle and began flipping through the documents. At first, they looked like ordinary property records. But then she noticed something unusual. Some of the documents were recent, only a few years old. She scanned the pages carefully. Land assessments, ownership maps, investment inquiries. Her heart skipped slightly. Many of the papers referenced development interest in the surrounding land. Large companies, construction proposals, even preliminary purchase offers. The numbers listed beside those offers were far higher than the estimates Marcus had been calculating at home. Far higher. Elena? Marcus's voice echoed from the doorway. She turned. What is it? He asked. She held up one of the papers. These are newer than I expected. Marcus stepped closer and took the document. His eyes moved quickly across the page. For the briefest moment, something sharp flashed in his expression. How much? He asked quietly. Elena pointed to the bottom of the page. Marcus read the number. Then another. And another. Daniel stepped into the room behind them. What did you find? He asked. Elena answered before Marcus could speak. Offers, she said. For the land. Daniel walked closer. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he saw the figures. Well, he said softly. That's more than I imagined. Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared at the papers in his hands. The silence in the room grew heavier. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I guess we'll have a lot to discuss with the lawyer. Marcus looked up slowly. Yes, he said. His voice was calm. But Elena could see something building beneath the surface. Something quiet. Something dangerous. Daniel seemed unaware of it. But Marcus wasn't looking at the documents anymore. He was looking at Daniel. As if the numbers on those pages had just turned the inheritance into something much bigger than money. Something worth fighting for. And in that moment, standing inside the silent study, Elena realized something she hadn't considered before. This house wasn't just filled with old memories. It was filled with decisions that had yet to be made. Decisions that would shape everything that followed. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees surrounding the estate. And somewhere within the old walls of the house, the quiet tension between the two men had already begun to grow. By the time the weekend arrived, the sky had turned a pale gray again, the kind of quiet overcast that made the countryside feel endless and slightly forgotten. Elena sat in the passenger seat as Marcus drove along the narrow highway leading toward the estate. Neither of them had spoken much during the drive. Fields stretched on both sides of the road, broken only by occasional clusters of trees and distant farmhouses. The farther they traveled, the more Elena felt like she was moving backward in time. She hadn't been to her grandmother's estate since she was 12. Back then, the place had seemed enormous, mysterious, almost magical. Now, as the road curved toward a long gravel driveway hidden behind tall oaks, Elena felt something else. Nervousness. Marcus slowed the car. There it is, he said. The estate appeared slowly between the trees. The house stood tall and silent, its faded white paint worn by years of weather. The porch wrapped around the front like tired arms, and ivy crept up one side of the structure as if nature had been quietly reclaiming it. Elena stepped out of the car and looked up at it. For a moment, childhood memories rushed back. Summer afternoons, the smell of old wood, her grandmother's quiet voice calling from the kitchen. But the house felt different now. Still. Empty. Marcus walked ahead, studying the building with a calculating expression. "This place is huge," he murmured. The front door opened with a long, creaking sound when Elena pushed it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating furniture that had not been moved in years. The house felt frozen, as if time had simply stopped. Elena walked slowly through the entryway, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floors. Photographs lined the walls. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, faces she recognized and others she didn't. Marcus barely glanced at them. He moved through the rooms quickly, examining doorways, ceilings, and windows. 3 floors, he said quietly, and look at the land surrounding it. Elena wasn't listening. Her attention was caught by a photograph near the staircase. It showed her grandmother standing proudly in the garden, her arm around 2 children. One of them was Elena. The other, Daniel. A car engine sounded outside. Marcus froze. "That must be him," he said. Elena stepped onto the porch just as another car rolled to a stop near the gravel drive. The man who stepped out looked older than the boy she remembered, but the resemblance was still there. Daniel Ward closed the car door and glanced toward the house. For a moment, the 3 of them simply looked at each other. Then Daniel gave a small nod. "Elena." His voice was calm. She walked toward him slowly. "It's been a long time," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. 15 years, I think. Marcus stepped forward. "And you're Daniel?" he said. The tone wasn't welcoming. Daniel noticed. "Marcus, right?" They shook hands briefly. Marcus's grip was firm. A little too firm. "Long drive?" Daniel asked casually. "Worth it," Marcus replied. Daniel looked toward the house. "I didn't expect it to be this big," he said. "It's impressive." Marcus folded his arms. "Yes," he said, "it is." The 3 of them walked back inside together. Elena led them through the house, opening doors that hadn't been touched in years. The kitchen still held old dishes and cabinets. The living room furniture remained covered in thin sheets. Daniel moved slowly through the rooms, occasionally pausing to study something. "This place hasn't changed much," he said quietly. Elena nodded. "My grandmother liked things the way they were." Marcus remained mostly silent. But Elena noticed something unsettling. Marcus wasn't exploring the house like someone seeing it for the first time. He was observing Daniel. Every movement. Every glance. As if measuring him. Eventually, Elena wandered into a study near the back of the house. Tall shelves filled with books lined the walls. A large wooden desk stood near the window. She opened one of the drawers. Inside were stacks of papers tied neatly with faded ribbon. Curious, she untied one bundle and began flipping through the documents. At first, they looked like ordinary property records. But then she noticed something unusual. Some of the documents were recent, only a few years old. She scanned the pages carefully. Land assessments, ownership maps, investment inquiries. Her heart skipped slightly. Many of the papers referenced development interest in the surrounding land. Large companies, construction proposals, even preliminary purchase offers. The numbers listed beside those offers were far higher than the estimates Marcus had been calculating at home. Far higher. Elena? Marcus's voice echoed from the doorway. She turned. What is it? He asked. She held up one of the papers. These are newer than I expected. Marcus stepped closer and took the document. His eyes moved quickly across the page. For the briefest moment, something sharp flashed in his expression. How much? He asked quietly. Elena pointed to the bottom of the page. Marcus read the number. Then another. And another. Daniel stepped into the room behind them. What did you find? He asked. Elena answered before Marcus could speak. Offers, she said. For the land. Daniel walked closer. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he saw the figures. Well, he said softly. That's more than I imagined. Marcus didn't respond. He simply stared at the papers in his hands. The silence in the room grew heavier. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I guess we'll have a lot to discuss with the lawyer. Marcus looked up slowly. Yes, he said. His voice was calm. But Elena could see something building beneath the surface. Something quiet. Something dangerous. Daniel seemed unaware of it. But Marcus wasn't looking at the documents anymore. He was looking at Daniel. As if the numbers on those pages had just turned the inheritance into something much bigger than money. Something worth fighting for. And in that moment, standing inside the silent study, Elena realized something she hadn't considered before. This house wasn't just filled with old memories. It was filled with decisions that had yet to be made. Decisions that would shape everything that followed. Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees surrounding the estate. And somewhere within the old walls of the house, the quiet tension between the two men had already begun to grow. By the time evening settled over the estate, the house had begun to feel less like a place of memory and more like a stage waiting for something inevitable to unfold. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the old window frames and whispering through the tall trees that surrounded the property. Inside, the three relatives moved through the house carefully, as if each step might disturb something fragile. Daniel spent most of the afternoon exploring the land behind the estate, occasionally taking photos with his phone. Marcus watched him from the porch more than once. Each time, his expression carried the same quiet calculation. Later, as the sky dimmed into early evening, Elena stood in the kitchen rinsing dust from a set of old glasses they had found in a cabinet. Marcus entered behind her. He's very comfortable here, Marcus said quietly. Elena glanced over her shoulder. Who? Marcus leaned against the counter. Daniel? Elena dried one of the glasses slowly. He grew up visiting this place too. Marcus shook his head slightly. That's not what I mean. Elena frowned. Then what do you mean? Marcus lowered his voice. Don't you think it's strange how quickly he showed up? The comment caught her off guard. The lawyer contacted him, she said. Marcus shrugged. Yes, but people don't drop everything for a simple family meeting. Elena turned toward him. It's not a simple meeting. We're inheriting a property together. Marcus studied her face carefully. And you trust him? The question hung in the air. Elena hesitated. I don't know him well anymore, she admitted, but he seems normal. Marcus let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Normal people don't stay away from family for 15 years and suddenly appear when there's money involved. Elena set the glass down. You're assuming the worst. Marcus stepped closer. I'm being realistic. Before she could answer, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Daniel appeared in the doorway, brushing dirt from his jacket. There's more land behind the orchard than I expected, he said casually. This place really is something. Marcus folded his arms. Yes, he said. It is. Daniel sensed the tension, but ignored it. I was thinking we should walk the property lines tomorrow, he added, just to understand what we're dealing with. Marcus responded before Elena could. We already understand it. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Do we? Marcus gestured toward the study where the documents had been found earlier. The numbers are clear. Daniel nodded slowly. They are. Then he added calmly, which means we'll need to make decisions together. Marcus's expression tightened. Elena stepped between them gently. I think we should wait for the lawyer before deciding anything. As if summoned by the suggestion, a car pulled into the gravel drive outside moments later. Daniel glanced toward the window. That might be her now. The woman who entered the house a few minutes later carried herself with the confidence of someone used to settling complicated matters. Margaret Holt was in her mid-50s, dressed in a dark coat and holding a leather briefcase under one arm. She shook hands with each of them before setting her documents across the dining table. I appreciate you all meeting here, she said. Your grandmother's estate is more complex than most inheritances. Marcus leaned forward slightly. How complex? Margaret opened a folder. The property itself is divided equally between Elena Ward and Daniel Ward, she explained. 50% ownership each. Daniel nodded calmly. Elena listened carefully. Marcus remained silent. Margaret continued. This division is legally fixed under the will. Neither party can sell the entire property without the consent of the other. Marcus finally spoke. So if one person refuses to sell, then the estate remains shared, Margaret said firmly. Marcus leaned back slowly. And if someone wants to buy the other half? That's possible, Margaret said, but only through mutual agreement. The conversation lasted another half hour, but Marcus said very little after that. When Margaret finally packed her documents and left the house, darkness had fully settled across the estate. Dinner was quiet. Daniel eventually excused himself and went upstairs to one of the guest rooms. Marcus remained in the kitchen, staring at the inheritance papers again. Elena stood beside him. You're very quiet, she said softly. Marcus didn't look up. Just thinking. About what? Marcus tapped the edge of the table slowly. About obstacles. Elena frowned. What obstacles? Marcus forced a small smile. Legal ones. But the smile didn't reach his eyes. Later that night, Elena woke suddenly. The house was silent, except for the wind outside. She reached toward Marcus's side of the bed. It was empty. Frowning, she slipped out of bed and stepped into the dark hallway. A faint light glowed near the back door. Marcus stood outside on the porch with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low. Elena couldn't hear everything he said, but she heard enough. Yes, Marcus whispered. It's exactly what I told you. A pause. Then his voice became colder. There's just one problem. Another pause. Elena stepped closer to the door, her heart beating faster. Marcus turned slightly, his back still toward the house. We can't move forward, he continued quietly, until the obstacles are removed. Silence followed. Then Marcus ended the call. For a moment, he simply stood there in the dark. Elena slipped back into the hallway before he could turn around. When Marcus returned to the bedroom minutes later, she pretended to be asleep. But her mind refused to rest. Because one question echoed in her thoughts long after the lights went out. Marcus had spoken about obstacles. And in a house where the inheritance was split exactly in half, there was only one person who stood in the way of everything Marcus seemed to want. By the time the next evening arrived, the atmosphere inside the estate had changed. What had once been quiet tension now felt heavier, the kind that lingered in the air like approaching thunder. The day had passed with awkward conversations and long stretches of silence. Daniel had spent most of the afternoon walking the property again, mapping the boundaries with surprising patience. Elena followed for a while, trying to remember pieces of her childhood buried somewhere in the tall grass and old orchard paths. Marcus stayed behind. When he finally joined them later, his mood seemed controlled, but distant. By dinner, the house felt too quiet. Elena set the table in the old dining room, while Marcus opened a bottle of wine they had found in the kitchen cabinet. Daniel entered a few minutes later, brushing dirt from his hands after returning from the yard. For a brief moment, the three of them stood around the table like strangers who had accidentally wandered into the same place. Daniel tried to lighten the mood. "I walked almost the entire property line today," he said as he sat down. "It's bigger than the map suggested." Marcus poured wine into 3 glasses. "Interesting," he said flatly. Daniel noticed the tone, but ignored it. "Some of the land near the southern fence could probably be leased out even before any development deal," Daniel added. "It might give us time to decide what we want to do." Marcus slid the glass across the table toward him. "You seem to have a lot of plans already." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Just ideas." Elena took a small sip of wine, watching the 2 men carefully. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Funny how quickly those ideas appear when money is involved." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Nothing. Just an observation." The tension returned immediately. Elena spoke quickly. "We're all still figuring things out. No one needs to rush decisions." Marcus nodded slowly, but his eyes remained on Daniel. "Of course," he said. The meal continued, but the conversation grew sharper. Small comments turned into quiet accusations. Daniel defended himself more than once, confused by Marcus's constant skepticism. Finally, Daniel set his fork down. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Marcus gestured casually. "Go ahead." Daniel looked directly at him. "Why do you assume I'm here for the money?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Because that's the only reason anyone would come." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "I came because my grandmother died." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "And the estate had nothing to do with it?" Daniel's patience began to thin. "I didn't even know about the estate until the lawyer contacted me." Marcus shrugged again. "Convenient." Elena placed her hand on the table. "That's enough." But the damage had already been done. Daniel stood up slowly. "You know what?" he said. "Believe whatever you want." Marcus didn't respond. Daniel looked at Elena. "I'm going for a walk," he said quietly. "I think we all need some space." He left the room without another word. The front door closed moments later. Silence filled the dining room. Elena turned toward Marcus. "Why did you push him like that?" Marcus looked confused. "I didn't push anyone. You know exactly what you were doing." Marcus took another sip of wine. "Elena, I'm trying to protect us." "From what?" "From someone who might try to take everything." Elena shook her head. "It doesn't have to be a fight." Marcus didn't answer. Later that night, the house finally grew quiet again. Daniel returned sometime after midnight, moving quietly upstairs to his room. Elena heard the faint creak of the staircase before drifting back to sleep. Hours passed. Then suddenly, voices. Elena's eyes opened. At first, she thought she was dreaming. But the shouting continued. 2 voices. "Marcus." "And Daniel?" Her heart began pounding. She threw the blanket aside and rushed into the hallway. The argument was coming from downstairs. She hurried down the staircase, her breath catching in her throat as the voices grew louder. You think I don't know what you're doing? Daniel shouted. Marcus's voice responded sharply. You don't know anything. Elena reached the bottom of the stairs. Then everything went silent. The quiet felt unnatural. Marcus, she called. No answer. She stepped into the living room and froze. Daniel lay on the wooden floor. Blood spread slowly across the boards beneath him. Elena gasped. Daniel? Marcus stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. What happened? Elena whispered. Marcus ran a hand through his hair. He attacked me. Elena rushed to Daniel's side, dropping to her knees. Daniel? Daniel, can you hear me? His eyes were half open, but unfocused. Blood stained the front of his shirt. Marcus spoke again, his voice shaking. He came at me with the fireplace poker. Elena looked around. The metal poker lay on the floor nearby. But something about the scene didn't make sense. Why would he do that? She asked. Marcus shook his head. I don't know. He was angry after dinner. Daniel tried to speak. Only a faint sound came out. Elena pressed her hand gently against the wound, panic flooding her voice. We need to call an ambulance. Marcus didn't move. Elena. Marcus, call someone. Finally, he grabbed his phone. But Elena couldn't stop staring at Daniel's face. The argument she had heard upstairs didn't sound like an attack. It sounded like a confrontation. And now Daniel was bleeding on the floor. Minutes later, sirens began echoing faintly through the countryside. Marcus stood silently near the wall. Elena noticed something strange then. His breathing had already slowed. Too quickly. As if the shock had passed faster than it should have. She looked around the room again. The poker. The overturned chair. The distance between Marcus and Daniel. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. The story Marcus was telling didn't match the silence that had followed the shouting. And as the distant police lights began to flash through the windows of the old estate, a terrifying thought slowly formed in Elena's mind. This wasn't just an accident. Something much darker had happened in this house tonight. And Marcus might not be telling the truth. The flashing lights of the police cars painted the old estate in waves of red and blue. By the time the ambulance arrived, the quiet countryside no longer felt peaceful. Officers moved quickly through the house, their voices low but urgent as they secured the scene. Elena stood near the staircase, her hands trembling as she watched paramedics kneel beside Daniel. They worked quickly. But after several minutes, one of them slowly shook his head. The movement was small. Final. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. Daniel Ward was gone. A heavy silence filled the room as the paramedics covered his body. The white sheet looked painfully bright against the dark wooden floor where the blood had begun to dry. Marcus sat in a chair near the wall, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked shaken. But something about his stillness made Elena uneasy. A woman stepped through the front door moments later, her posture straight, her eyes sharp as she took in the scene with quiet precision. Detective Sarah Vaughn. She was in her early 40s, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm but observant. While the other officers moved around collecting evidence, she remained still for a moment, studying the room. Her gaze moved from the body to the fireplace poker, and finally to Marcus. Who made the emergency call? She asked. Marcus lifted his hand slowly. I did. Detective Vaughn approached him. Marcus Ward? Yes. Her voice remained calm. Tell me what happened tonight. Marcus swallowed and glanced briefly toward Elena before speaking. He attacked me. The words came out quickly. We argued after dinner, he continued. He got angry and grabbed the fireplace poker. Detective Vaughn nodded slightly. And then? Marcus rubbed his forehead. I tried to calm him down, but he swung at me. I pushed him away and he fell. Elena listened carefully. The explanation sounded simple. Too simple. Detective Vaughn looked down at the poker on the floor. And he injured himself when he fell? Marcus hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second. Yes. The detective crouched beside the weapon, but didn't touch it. Did anyone else witness the confrontation? Marcus shook his head. Elena was upstairs. Detective Vaughn turned toward her. Ma'am, could you come over here for a moment? Elena stepped forward slowly. Her voice felt fragile. I woke up when I heard them arguing. What kind of argument? The detective asked. Elena hesitated. I'm not sure. I couldn't hear everything. Detective Vaughn studied her expression carefully. When you came downstairs, what did you see? Elena swallowed. Daniel was already on the floor. And Marcus? He was standing nearby. Detective Vaughn nodded slowly, absorbing the details. Did Daniel have the poker in his hand? Elena looked toward the weapon again. No. Marcus shifted slightly in his chair. I knocked it away from him, he said quickly. Detective Vaughn wrote something in her notebook. The investigation continued for the next hour. Photographs were taken. Measurements recorded. The room filled with the quiet sounds of professionals reconstructing a moment none of them had witnessed. But Detective Vaughn moved more slowly than the others. She studied small details. The distance between the body and the poker. The overturned chair. The angle of the wound. Eventually, she stepped outside onto the porch where Elena sat wrapped in a blanket. The night air was cold, and the flashing police lights reflected faintly in the distance. Detective Vaughn sat beside her. I know this is a difficult moment, she said gently. Elena nodded without looking up. We were supposed to divide the property tomorrow, she whispered. The detective remained silent for a moment before asking another question. Had there been tension between the two men before tonight? Elena hesitated. Yes. How serious? She thought back to the dinner table. Marcus's accusations. Daniel's growing frustration. They argued, she admitted, mostly about the inheritance. Detective Vaughn watched her carefully. Did Marcus ever threaten Daniel? The question made Elena flinch. No, she said quickly. But even as she spoke, memories began pushing their way into her mind. Marcus whispering about obstacles. Marcus watching Daniel with quiet hostility. Marcus researching the estate late at night. She had dismissed those moments. Ignored them. Detective Vaughn spoke again, her voice calm but deliberate. Sometimes arguments escalate unexpectedly, she said. Elena nodded weakly. But sometimes, the detective continued, they don't. Elena finally looked at her. What do you mean? Detective Vaughn folded her hands together. I mean that certain details in this room don't match the story we were given. Elena felt her chest tighten. What kind of details? The detective glanced toward the house. For one thing, the wound Daniel suffered doesn't appear consistent with a simple fall. Elena's stomach twisted. In the poker? She asked. Detective Vaughn shook her head slightly. It's possible he held it at some point, she said. But right now, we can't confirm that. The silence between them grew heavier. Finally, the detective asked one last question. Elena, do you believe your husband? The words struck harder than Elena expected. Yes, she said automatically. But the answer didn't feel as certain as it should have. Detective Vaughn stood up slowly. We'll continue the investigation tomorrow, she said. For now, try to get some rest. As the detective walked back toward the house, Elena remained on the porch, staring into the darkness. Her thoughts replayed the night again and again. The argument. The silence afterward. Marcus's calm voice explaining what had happened. And suddenly, another memory surfaced. Marcus whispering on the porch just the night before. We can't move forward until the obstacles are removed. At the time, she hadn't wanted to understand what he meant. Now the meaning felt painfully clear. Elena looked toward the house where Marcus was still being questioned. For years, she had trusted him completely. But tonight, for the first time since their marriage began, a terrifying possibility entered her mind. What if Marcus hadn't lost control during the argument? What if he had been waiting for it,